right, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are in our wide world. Welcome to another NetHope Strategic Conversation webinar. My name is Seth Otto, and I'm the Digital Communications Manager here at NetHope and the producer of the NetHope webinar series. And we are delighted to be joined today by representatives from NetHope member Orbis International and Avanade, who's a valued and appreciated NetHope partner. And they will be engaging with all of us today for a NetHope strategic conversation about AI ethics today and walking the line between fear and hype in generative AI and its good uses in the nonprofit sector. So let's go over a bit of housekeeping before we get started. First off, let's make this webinar interactive. Let us know what comes up for you. Please post your comments and questions in the chat window. The presenters will address them during the question and answer period. Pay attention to your inbox for a follow-up email that we will send your way in the hours following today's webinar. The email will include links to the webinar recording, the slides, and any other resources shared during today's presentation and discussion. And we would very much appreciate your feedback. Your opinion matters to us, and we use your responses to our survey to improve this webinar series for you and our broader NetHope community. It also provides our presenters with an opportunity to connect with you if you want them to. All that out of our way, I would like to welcome today's presenters. Daniela Weber is the Deputy Director for NetHope's Center for the Digital Nonprofit. Dr. Nicholas Chicard is a Principal Architect for Orbis International. Sarah Spencer works as an independent consultant and researcher in AI ethics, policy, and AI. Natalia Schmidt is a Director for Digital Advocacy, Data, and AI at Avanade. Daniela, I will now hand things over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you for everyone who's joining us from across the world. We have quite a great spread of countries here, which is wonderful to see. AI is not new, and neither is the discussion about the ethics of AI. In the NetHope community, we have discussed this issue since the inception of our AI working group, which was in 2019. And with our members and partners, we generated the first AI ethics for nonprofit toolkit at the time for the sector on how to implement and use AI responsibly and ethically. However, with the arrival of generative AI, this discussion has moved to a whole new level. There is a lot of buzz, and quite rightly so, I think, about the opportunities of AI and the benefit it can deliver for a sector. But as we start engaging with these new tools, what do we need to think about to ensure we use them responsibly and safely? And there are so many aspects to this. From the way the tools work, do they give biased or factually incorrect answers, to questions about data protection, the copyright of the data used in large language models, to the wider societal and geopolitical impacts through broad loss of jobs, disinformation, cyber warfare. Already now we see malicious generative AI tools that are being created, such as WarmGPT and PoisonGPT. It's these different aspects of AI ethics that we want to shine a light on today, and our panelists will give us their views of the opportunities, the risks, and how we might walk that line between fear and hype. We will start with short presentations by each of the panelists, but we very much want this to be a lively discussion. So please, as Seth already said, do make use of the chat to ask questions and to share your own thoughts. And with that, I will first hand over to Nicolas. He works for Orbis, one of our NetHope members, whose mission is to fight avoidable blindness. And Orbis already uses AI today to help with that mission. So Nicolas will talk us through that real-life example and how Orbis ensures that their use of AI is safe, equitable, and ethical. Over to you, Nicolas.
Right. Thank you, Daniela, for the kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. This is a very important topic for us, and I'm going to approach it from a implementation standpoint. As Daniela mentioned, we have products that are being used that are AI enabled, and we learn quite a few valuable lessons from their deployment and development that I'm hoping to go over in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So as Daniela mentioned, we are an NGO fighting preventable blindness. We do this kind of using two models. The first one is through kind of in-person care and training. The second one is through kind of digital services and products, and I'm going to focus on the latter today. Next slide, please. So one of the main service I'm going to discuss today is our assistive AI product that is used for eye screening. And the idea behind it is that patient get image. So you have this gentleman here in the foreground, and you have this camera that will take a photo of the back of the eye. And those photographs are uploaded to our products. They're automatically interpreted, and we basically detect signs of sight-threatening disease and conditions. And we provide recommendation for next steps. And the goal is to provide healthcare professionals in low to middle income countries with all the information they need to think about next step for the patient and how to best monitor them and treat them in their kind of patient journey. Next slide, please. So this quote have been overused, but I couldn't think of anything better to show here. So this is from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And this is very topical because AI is becoming kind of a superpower in the sense that it allows us to do things that we thought, a few years back. I've been in machine learning for 12 years now. And even a few years back, some of the things we're doing today, we thought were impossible or science fiction. But the responsibilities that come with it is how do we do it safely and ethically? And I think this is more difficult than resolving the technical question, actually, how we did it. Now we need to understand how we deploy it safely and ethically. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on two main topics that are related to ethics today. The first one is safety. So how do we make sure that users do not get harmed by our AI products? And the second one is equity and fairness, making sure that our AI works everywhere and is optimized for all our patients, but also that we focus on areas where it is most needed. And on the right-hand side, you can see a few of the topics I'm going to discuss over the next 2 minutes or so. The first two ones, safety first, user experience, and software railguards, are kind of linked topics. And this is about how creating a machine learning model or an AI model is kind of the first step, but it's not, nowadays, it's not the most complicated part of the process. You need to have kind of a very robust kind of software layer around your machine learning model to make it safe for use and to prevent intentional or unintentional misuse of your AI product. For instance, we need to ensure that our users who are healthcare professionals cannot misclick or upload the wrong type of data to the system so that the system would provide, for example, a recommendation that would not be applicable to the patient or could be harmful for the patient. So it is very important to have these safeguards and railguards in place. This is relatively easy to do for quote-unquote conventional machine learning. So we use a lot of classification, looking at image, saying whether that image is normal or has some kind of sight-threatening condition on it. It's very hard to do for generative AI. As far as I know, even big tech companies are really struggling with this, is to how do you ensure that the output from your AI are not harmful to the users or not just pure hallucination from the system. One other aspect that I think something we learn with experience and monitoring is really important. Thinking about ethics and safety and equity and fairness is not a one-time process during development implementation. This is something you need to do over time and continuously. And most of the kind of measures we put in place are measures that where we detected kind of issues or failings, and we needed to add additional measure in place to reduce the risk of using our AI products. One that is fairly known is the use of data sets and making sure that the data sets are representative of your target population, in our case, our patients, but also are not biased. It's impossible to make something completely void of bias, but we can use technical approaches to make sure that the bias is minimized so that it is performing equally well for everyone involved and the risk of harm is minimized. The last one I wanted to mention very quickly is targeted deployments. AI is not magic. It's not going to solve all your issues, especially as an NGO. And I think it's very important to think about whether AI is the right tool for you, and if it is the right tool for your users as well, because surprisingly, there is very little evidence of real-world benefit of using AI, especially in kind of the NGO setting. And I think this is very important to think long and hard before you start deploying AI because the default of AI is to will eventually lead to harm. So it's a lot of effort to make sure it does not happen. It's something you need to think really hard about when deploying AI. Next slide, please. So I'm all done for now. I'm really looking forward to joining the conversation. Here are my details, but I'm sure you can find them or ask NetHope for them. I'm very much happy to answer any question you may have after the presentations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nicolas, for giving us this glimpse into a real life application and how you're managing AI and the risks of AI. And there were some interesting points in there that I will come back to when we go into the Q&A. But I'm now going to hand over to Sarah. Sarah spent the last 4 years almost exclusively on issues related to AI policy and ethics and the intersection with the Sustainable Development Goals, humanitarian aid, and foreign policy. She has worked with nonprofits, the United Nations, and the UK government to explore AI and its impact on conflict and humanitarian aid. Sarah, is AI a friend or a foe for nonprofits?
Let's wait and see is the answer. I think it sort of depends on how we negotiate that relationship ourselves. I appreciate Nicola's deep dive into a use case. I think that's really helpful as a starter. I want to take us a bit wider and think about the ecosystem of development agencies and humanitarian agencies with which I've worked before my AI journey, worked for 20 plus years. Next slide, please. So the first thing to say is that a quick word on AI and AI ethics. I'm doing a degree at the moment on AI ethics at Cambridge, and I will say everything gets thrown into the kitchen sink of AI ethics. If it's nothing to do with computer science and sigmas equals n/y, it gets thrown into ethics, which is a problem because it means it remains as vague and therefore not incredibly helpful. So definitions and precision matter. When I first started doing a lot of sort of work on AI about 3 or 4 years ago, we were in such an early stage, as Nicola said, you know, we just never thought we would be in the place we are now. And I think I was a bit lazy about definitions a couple of years ago, thinking it didn't really matter that much. It was all sort of pedantic. And I think it really does matter now because the discussions that you see coming from big tech moguls before US Congress and the EU and the lobbying around specific regulations all are to do with specific branches or forms within the sort of AI basket. And so therefore, I'm not going to speak specifically today around generative AI, but I'll talk about AI as a field. But there are multiple subgroups within that. Equally, the Turing Institute in the UK set out to define sort of AI ethics. I don't think there's a great definition still, to be honest. And I think there's a need to update this, but I'll talk about what that means for humanitarian and development agencies. And I've seen quite a few of them in the participants list as well. And Rakesh's comment around, you know, what does that look like in practice? So I'll talk about that as well. And at the end, next slide, please. So opportunities. So, I mean, this won't come as a surprise to those of you who are sort of working directly with development and humanitarian agencies, but I think there's really sort of 2 big baskets under which the opportunities fall. One is about sort of insights and analysis and data and trying to understand more with better analytical tools. The second one is about increasing efficiencies, reducing human error, freeing up human time for human tasks. There is a third basket about completely new capabilities or products. This is where we think about AI for drug discovery or additional, I've seen that there's an MSF person on the phone, you know, additional sort of like therapeutic feeding products, things that AI could help us discover, but I'm going to park that. I won't go through these bullet points in detail, but there have been some interesting sort of use cases. Predicting spikes in need, for example, cholera spreads in a very unique and interesting way. And I have seen some stuff coming from NASA partnering with local NGOs to try and anticipate where the next hand washing stations should be positioned on the basis of historic data and satellite imagery, which is, you know, in my mind, sort of no harm, no foul. You're putting hand washing stations and deploying resources in areas to try and prevent a wider epidemic of cholera. Interesting use case. ICRC's RedSafe is trying to work out a way to create digital vaults to help populations on the move and displaced populations carry documents that are relevant for them. So land titles and deeds, birth certificates, passport information, which is not necessarily sort of an AI application, but it links into ways in which they're exploring sort of the digital world safely. And then I think this is the sort of like less sexy option. I hate that phrase, but the less sexy option is really about strengthening operational effectiveness, spotting fraud and outlier transactions. You think about the thousands of lines, millions of lines of Excel sheets that we all have now in our sort of donor budgets, trying to spot, a sort of logistics, PR, PO order, or whatever, purchase order, and things that feel sort of out of the ordinary, or predictive maintenance for our operational infrastructure like fleet management. I think there's a great deal of opportunity there, but those are the ones that are not talked about because they're not that they don't make the front page of the New York Times. Next slide. I try not to get too hung up on the concerns. They are growing. I think sort of thinking about individual models, AI models, and at the individual sort of beneficiary level, the biggest focus has been on algorithmic failures, inclusion and exclusion errors, sort of people who fall on the wrong side of statistical calculations, who gets to be included in your services or not. There is another wider issue that I think doesn't get spoken about enough, which is around what the use of AI does to our global efforts to try and shift power to the global South and to indigenous justice movements. So, I'm in Kenya at the moment. There's a very active climate change and environmental justice movement here. There's also a very big movement from big tech in Nairobi to try and sort of occupy space related to climate change and AI. And I guess my question is, what does that do to indigenous justice movements who are trying to advocate for political change in these countries? Can they be complementary? Probably. Are they right now? Probably not. And then there is a question about impartiality for humanitarian agencies on the line and the sort of instrumentalization of our agendas. I think we need to really carefully think that through. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then at the strategic level, this stuff is talked about a lot and doesn't really feel relevant to NGOs and nonprofits, but the geopolitical competition and sort of tech firms as geopolitical entities is a real issue. And it's changing sort of the environments in which we work in a way that we are sort of now used to talking about, like BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin, and that sort of environment in which we work is changing quite rapidly. And I think it's worth us sort of pausing to think about what that means, what the political economy of that landscape means for the way in which we engage with tech firms. Last slide. So these are my normal takeaways for clients and for nonprofits that I work with. So there's some of them are obvious, but why do you want to use AI? What is the specific problem you're trying to solve, and is AI the best solution? Sometimes it is, sometimes it really isn't. And this is the sort of Albert Einstein, or allegedly Albert Einstein, quote about spending 90% of your thought energy on the problem rather than the solution. The next one is sort of, this is why I've put the sphere standards cartoon here from the Nepal 2015 earthquake, but why do they want you to use AI? There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? I can say, as I work for the British government and I'm on sabbatical at the moment, I can say that we certainly get past sort of technological tools that are vaguely off the shelf and sort of vaguely fit for purpose, but that do not perform the way we want them to, because they're sort of free or cheap. And I think there is a real question to be asked about the tech companies that are offering at market price or below market price services and software, including AI, to nonprofits. You need to actually do your due diligence about what the issues are there. What are your ethical limits? This is the point that Rakesh made and Nicola raised as well. We've got to get beyond the hype. Words like guardrails and establishing, good practice, like that doesn't mean anything. So if I were, the senior vice president of X agency, I'd be saying, right, which programs are in and out? Which ones do not get touched by AI? Where do we look to for using AI? Is it okay to use generative AI for donor proposals? If so, which donor proposals? If so, which data? And if so, which AI firms or which AI models based on which sources of based on which, how are those models built? And that gets to the last point about the supply chain. I mean, these are things that we do as nonprofits, humanitarian and development agencies. We really look upstream to where things come from and how those affect some of the political economy in which we work in. But I don't think we're doing it enough with tech suppliers. And it's really critical. Unless you have in-house people developing algorithms and software, you have to do a bit of back-end analysis, much of which is fairly easy to do from a desk, but there is not enough of that happening. And I think that pulls us into risky territory related to instrumentalizing the agenda of development and aid agencies. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Lots of food for thought, and a good segue, I think, also into Natalia. Natalia works for Amanat, who is a NetHope partner, and she helps organizations to identify and prioritize practical actions to embrace the value of data and AI. So Natalia, please give us your view on what nonprofit organizations need to consider and how the use of AI can be responsible by design.
Perfect, thank you. And as you said, it really does go neatly from the whole presentation flow, right? We start from the use case to the considerations and risks from Sarah, and now I'm going to try to wrap it up a bit with some guardrails that are also needed. But the question is how, right? How do you approach this? How do you make it in a practical way? So I'm going to start on the next slide. It's just really again a reminder why we're here. Is that exactly as you said, Daniela, in the beginning, we're talking about AI, and as Sarah said, and generative AI, it doesn't really matter, but the hype of generative AI allows us to talk more about this, because now it's more present, it's everywhere, people are using it, if we want it or not, even more than they have been using AI in the past. So it created this hype, and it created the necessity to deal with the issues of the ethical considerations. So it helped us to make these conversations. And there's a lot of considerations, copyright considerations that are different than the traditional AI, IP ownership, biased questions, biased answers. It always has been a challenge in AI. It's not new. The data that we use to create those models and the decisions that we make based on this is based on this data that we created as humans. So it's always been there, the challenge. But proprietary data and the inaccuracy is even more difficult because less understood. So, and I'm sure both Nicholas and Sarah know what I mean. In AI, it's always been a challenge of the accuracy of the models, but now it's different in a sense that people expect something different from, for example, a ChatGPT. They put in a question, they expect a knowledge which it's not linked to. So it's the awareness, the understanding of the models that is even more important than ever. And misinformation at scale, another societal impact that we have in here, which is not just technical, which is something that we might not see because it's now the big scale of the problem. And a bit more terminology in the next slide. Because, and again, it goes neatly to what Sarah said. It has to have those three components, three challenges that we need to cover. And this is exactly what the digital ethics needs to respond to identify and address those risks in all those components, in personal, people, private, accessibility, mental issues, all of these personal questions, all of the societal questions and risks that we have, economic, educational impact of ChatGPT on education, one of the easy, most recent examples, environmental, planet, energy use, sustainability, all of this power that we use to create those models, use those models, we have to think about the environmental impacts as well. And programmatic, last but not least, which we heard in the beginning from Nicholas as well, how do you put it into practice in your not only development, but deployment and usage, which is another element which has sometimes gets forgotten, that you have the whole chain of using AI. It's not only necessary that people who develop, the data scientists, the data engineers that develop those tools, that they ensure transparency and explainability, but also the users are aware of what they're using it for and how they're using it and how they make decisions based on what they have in the data in the system and in the AI. And in the part of the programmatic is also the compliance. which on the next page I just brought, and I know we have a very international group here today, which I'm amazed with. I'm really amazed to see that. Just an example. So I do know that this is just European Union is taking this stand with the new AI Act, but there is the similar considerations in United States, in other countries. So it's really something that is broadly now. EU was one of the first starting the discussions. Not sure if they're not anymore one of the first implementing it, but we're close to finalizing the discussions on this AI Act for Europe, and it will be in act, and we have to respond to that in Europe to be compliant. So compliance, again, if you go in your mindset back to the previous one, society, human and environment, and the compliance and the technological components. It's just one of the components. And I think this is what I've learned talking to a non-profit organization. I had the pleasure a couple of weeks ago to talk to some of those organizations, and I realized that it's really just one of the aspects. The compliance to the regulation is needed, is necessity, but for non-profits, it's just so much more than that. And it should be for everyone else, but especially for non-profits, due to your own standards, due to your type of work and your beneficiaries that expect from you even higher standards than from everyone else. So this is the regulatory compliance. So on the next page, on the how do we do that, right? It sounds scary, it sounds a lot. And the how is pragmatic. Take a deep breath. It's doable. Let's look at it together. We have frameworks to address it, right? So you're not in it alone, and it might sound like big ethical problems, but we need to break it down into different components, and we need to address them. And you need to address principles and governance. And yes, principles and governance in itself, they don't solve any problems. If they're not applied, if they're not understood, which is combining directly with the culture and the training. So this is often a problem of guidelines. You put in guidelines, first of all, like Sarah said, they are not concrete. They're just say like, don't do that. But you have to specify exactly what you're not supposed to do, which data, what is it that you're using it for, what is it that you're not using it for. You have to think about how a solution can be misused. And this is an ethics board that can look into that and try to put yourself into a mindset of a bad person, say, how would I misuse this solution? And this is part of the governance process, that you have to think about how can it be misused, how can it be used wrongly, and it has to be specific, and it has to be part of your culture, and it has to be based on your own principles, right? Again, we're in this very specific sector of nonprofits or non-governmental organizations, which really have to take care. They have their own, you have your own principles, your own standards, your own guidelines, and this has to be in line with it. And this is why there is the framework, but there is no plug and play solution for responsible by design. This is designing it together, designing it based on your processes, on how you deal with those questions right now. How do you develop, deploy, use AI in your organization? And we can plug those additional elements in to ensure that every time it works like a system by design, being responsible. And I think this is it, my three key takes away in the end, on the last slide. There are higher expectations from NGOs. The ethical standards, well, should be higher. You're there as a lighthouse for everyone else to show how ethics can be implemented, how important it is. And it needs to be based on processes, decisions, and behaviors. So those behaviors needs to be anchored in the culture. So for me, it's not about judging a technology, if it's ethical or not, but it's about how we make ethical decisions. Because the ethical component, we will not ever force AI to be ethical. We have to be the ethical ones, and ethical is a very difficult decision to make if something is ethical or not. So you really have to be the one that is taking those decisions, and it's beyond compliance. Compliance is an important aspect. We need to be compliant. Regulations all over the world are coming. We need to be compliant, but this is much more than that, to be ethical and safe and responsible around AI. And those four buckets, for principles, let's think about principles, governance, technology, and culture to help you divide this big elephant into small pieces and pragmatically approach this challenge. which is, I think, a big opportunity as well. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Wow, lots of food for thought, and I can already see there's lots of questions and comments coming in the chat, and I'm going to come to those, but I'm going to ask one question first myself, because really all your presentations triggered that in my mind. This stuff is complex, right? So you need to think about all the risks, the issues, the technology, the suppliers, etc., etc., etc. Now, nonprofits are usually quite short on resources, right? How can nonprofits build that capability to deal with that complexity, to make sure they're putting the right guardrails around AI, to make sure they can train people in the safe use of AI? Nicola, how have you approached that?
Well, I'm the testament that Orbis decided to hire someone from machine learning or AI background. And I realize it's quite rare. We have very few kind of NGOs in general don't tend to have very big technical teams, even less so kind of in kind of more cutting edge field like AI and machine learning. My gut feeling when answering that is there's no shortcut, there's no replacement for someone who has the knowledge and experience. There's so many pitfalls you have to think about. So not just technical and finding suppliers that are reliable and what have you, but in the implementation of it. And I don't, you either have someone in-house or find a reliable consultant that can help you. Unfortunately, I don't think the field is mature enough to have, a turnkey solution where you can go to a provider that can think about all these things for you, because as these different presentations shown is our understanding of ethics, of how to deploy AI safely is kind of changing almost day by day. And I think we are still not quite understanding what it all means. So I'm sure eventually as it matures and we are beyond the hype, there will be solutions to address this. But right now I would suggest that either having someone full-time, as there are many, in my experience, there are many machine learning engineers and former CTOs or whatever that are more than happy to work in the NGO sectors. Actually got quite a few of my colleagues from startups to work in NGOs around the world. And I think there is no beating this, because I don't think this is a part-time job. We spent so long, it took us 3 years to go to quote unquote market, even though we're free to use, but to validate, to make sure we have, regulatory approvals, to have everything in place. And this cannot be done, just in a one-off workshop with someone in-house or close to the organization that has the knowledge and experience, in my mind.
Thank you, Nicola. Natalia, what are the possibilities out there when it, for example, comes to training? Is there something you can recommend, something where people can go?
I think there's many trainings around responsible AI, but I think again, as I mentioned, the challenge is that this is more of a specific definition in each organization, right? Or there is no one definition, and that is why even a training needs to be very specific to what does it mean for you, what principles do you have, how have you implemented it in your organizations. So yes, there are general trainings linked off to technology, like Microsoft training specifically around responsible, how it is done in specific solutions. But I think there's a need for additional awareness and organizational specific trainings. And the training could be a brown bag session. So back to your question on foundings, right? It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be pragmatic. Let's do a brown bag with an expert. Let's do a webinar and raise awareness, internal organizational things that raise awareness and raise this transparency and understanding.
Absolutely, thank you. Sarah, what are you seeing? How do the organizations you work with grapple with that resource issue and capability issue?
I mean, I speak from both sides, right? Because I worked for a number of humanitarian organizations that received donor money, and then I worked as a donor giving the money. And I gotta say, is it expensive? I mean, let's open that question, because what's the model? Do we have in-house a team of Nicolas and we have like loads of machine learning engineers and AI scientists and whatever, the answer is no, right? That's never going to happen. That was the model like 4 or 5 years ago for sure. And like DRC and loads of agencies were trying to bring in what that looked like. Say the Children had a few, but they couldn't compete because the salaries are too high, the sort of risk appetite or the interest or the understanding of what that looked like within agencies was so low. That the incentives for these engineers to stay or scientists to stay in the firms was pretty low. And then the other option used to be big tech coming out with all their sort of like free goods to everyone and everyone getting excited that, sort of Sheryl Sandberg has called them and, let's figure out how to lean into AI. And I think there's a different model now. And this gets to Maz's question around sort of Ali's question around looking at the global south. I mean, I'm in Kenya. There are a lot of AI firms and machine learning firms here that are sort of small to medium-sized enterprises that are explicitly financed through VCs. This is like where the finance supply chain is really interesting, to focus only on the SDGs, and the connection between sort of nonprofits, NGOs, UN agencies, and this group of very technologically capable firms is like not happening, because the big sort of big NGOs are going towards the big tech, and I think that's a problem. So I think the question about the expense of it needs to be challenged, or at least thought through, like analyze a bit more. There is as Natalia says, around training, and Maz said it in sort of digital and data sort of competency or literacy. During some sessions in Geneva last month, we had this discussion, and we used to say that sort of competency in Microsoft Word or Microsoft Office was a prerequisite for a job. I mean, we have to just get to a point where basic data literacy, not even digital, like basic data, like understanding how statistics works, will have to be a core part of some people's jobs. It just will have to be, because we're moving to that world. It's no longer good enough. And training is a core element of that. And I think actually bespoke training designed on the needs. I mean, back in the olden days, we used to do training needs assessments, right? We need to do that similar thing. It's not good enough to be like, oh, I've just seen this like edX or IBM something. It's not relevant if you're working for MSF in car, or you need to figure out what you really, really need to understand about AI and why that's relevant.
Thank you, Sarah. It is a complex topic. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat here. And Rakesh is asking about how Orbis as a medical entity giving medical services presumably has a deep culture of harm reduction and ethics. How can, as a non-profit organizations, build that culture? And I'm also going to add another point that Rakesh made here around whose responsibility is it if somebody goes wrong? Who's accountable? Nicola, can I put you on the spot for this one?
Sure. So the way we manage it is that we are very risk averse. As I mentioned, it took us 3 years to go from a point where we had a product or we had something working to something we are happy to use on the ground for screening programs, for example. And most of that time was not spent developing software or training models, was spent understanding the risk associated with deploying AI for eye screening. So there are multiple risks, risk to harm to the patient if you miss something, or regulatory risk of how do we stay in compliance with, for example, medical device regulation and so on. So I think we are managing by being risk averse. I think this is something that Orbis in general, and I think you have to do as a kind of, not a healthcare provider, but someone at an organization working in healthcare. Risk management is a core value that kind of impact all activities, whether it's technical or otherwise in the organization. What was the second part of the question? Sorry, I forgot about it.
It was really around accountability. So
yes,
who's accountable? Because the AI won't be.
I think this is a big topic of discussion. I think in our case, we are accountable for what our softwares produce and for their, failings. This is a some things also happen in commercial settings. So there are a commercial version of what we do. And right now, the model is that the company selling the product is liable for any kind of misdiagnosis or something. But now, you start seeing insurances coming up with plans to protect against that and against, especially the medical sector. But in our case, we are liable because at the end of the day, we are making the recommendation, but we are in a slightly better position, as in we are in the assistive AI business, in that we do not aim to replace the human in screening programs. We are providing them with more information, and they are there and they have the experience to make an informed decision based on the data we provide them and on their kind of own knowledge and experience of eye care. So we kind of have this kind of buffer in that the word of the machine is not final. So it's still an interpretation of it by someone knowledgeable in the domain. But I can imagine this is a big, right now we can go on Bing and generate stuff using OpenAI. I don't think Microsoft will be found liable for it if harm happens as a result of using that tool. But I think this is a very important topic. But in our case, we're taking responsibility of the outputs we're producing with AI products.
That sounds reasonable. Thank you, Nicola.
Can I? I was going to just jump in there quickly. I was going to jump in there quickly and link it to Nicholas's question in the chat around open source AI and accountability. I mean, this is an issue that Kenyan firms are dealing with like daily, in that they're being required to develop intellectual property and algorithms that are fundamentally open source because of the nature of the funding that they're receiving, which is handcuffing them, right? Because they're trying to be the next unicorn and they want to follow the playbook of Silicon Valley. And actually, so they're building their models on things like ChatGPT and earlier versions of it from OpenAI, which were originally open by virtue of the name, and are now shut. And so most of the models, and Nicola and Natalia can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the models are now being built upon Meta's models, really. And there is a whole ethical supply chain that we need to examine on that basis to say, right, well, whose algorithms are we procuring on the basis of what foundation? And also from a global South perspective, when Meta decides to cut off that supply, which is what OpenAI did, what does that mean for firms in the global South and shifting our supply chains and procuring locally rather than, sort of multinationally is a hot topic.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Natalia, I'm going to ask you some of the questions that I see popping up here, because you were talking about frameworks and legislation. Now the EU is working on legislation, the US is looking at it, other countries are looking at it. Are we going to have the same challenge as we have with data privacy legislation, which ended up being quite different across the world? Some people I see talk about there should be a global agency legislating or guide railing AI. What is your view on that?
A very futuristic view to have something. I think that would be a nice, really a good thing to have that. I honestly don't think I will live long to see a global agency taking care of AI. I think it's taking long enough for bigger countries like the US or a European Union as a union to take care of this legislation, to agree on something. And while they were talking about AI, Gen AI popped in. So they had to start basically, or at least additions, to put additions into the legislation. So I think globally, would make sense, but I don't see it happening in any near future, honestly.
And what about frameworks? I have a question here about good frameworks that are already out there and available. Anything you have seen that struck you as useful?
Yes, I mean, there's many and there's a lot of help. I mean, if you think about the EU legislation, they come in not only with the legislative text, which is horrible, but they come in with supportive documents, supportive tools, frameworks that help you implement that. So on the one hand, already even from those organizations, there's additional frameworks. And of course, companies like us, we do have frameworks around that. I've just shown a big buckets of it, but behind that, there's a lot of additional frameworks, best practices, because I think that's also something that helps, a best practice. How do others do that? It was also one of the questions. So happy to share that also after the sessions. Just contact me directly and we can share a bit more around other companies, how they have done it or how we have done it with them, to share some more examples of those practices. Yeah.
And this is a lovely question from Matthew. Following the Titanic disaster, a lot of things changed. That's right. Have we had a Titanic type disaster in the AI space, in non-profit or for-profit?
I will say, just because I did note that question down from Matthew Scott, is that I in a sort of off the record conversation that happened last summer with lots of different sort of multi-domain expertise is what computer scientists would say, but we would say multi-industry or like cross-sector people at the table. People were saying that, you know, the real AI regulation is not going to bite until there is a Titanic. Basically, you've got to have, it's the same with biochemical weapons and things that we've seen from a humanitarian perspective. We've got tremendous regulation around weapons of war because we saw a tremendous effect, not before it happened. So I'm not going to take a stake. I'm not going to plant my flag in the ground anywhere, but that was the resounding conclusion from a group of 15 experts around a table last summer.
I think it's an interesting point of view because from my perspective, almost, I mean, probably not a Titanic, but so many things already happened in the AI space, in even predictive tools that were used in the US to predict who is going to go on bail or not, like in a public legislation system. And I mean, that's amazing. It went so wrong as we could imagine. So it was, for me at least, a Titanic, right? If you're in a space and you look for so many things that happened, or industry organizations putting in their own IP protected code into ChatGPT and this getting out. So they lost their own IP. So I mean, that's so many things happening. So I don't know. It's maybe not the Titanic enough yet, but
on that point, Natalia, the other thing that's amazing, and I maybe it's to Nicola's point at the beginning of the session, is that, you know, the predictions around AGI 5 years ago, artificial generalized intelligence, were like 2070, right? And they've all been put forward. I mean, some people are putting them behind closed doors, some people are putting them at 2025 behind closed doors, but some, you know, we're really talking 2030 now, 2035. And I think that's, so this is where I, in my talk was like, right, let's separate out generative AI, machine learning from AGI, because that's where everyone's getting very excited and scared and terrified about the fact that we're going to get AGI much sooner than we thought. But you're right, 100%. You're right that the individualized harms are just as noteworthy as AGI appearing in 2 years. Absolutely.
A few of the questions and comments also refer to representation, and that's in the expertise and those that build and deploy them. How do you involve these communities? How do you ensure representation? What are the things we can do, Sarah? I know you're raring to say something now.
I am. Stu Campo was on the line at one point, but I think there's, I mean, these are complicated conversations to have. These are complicated technologies, but the principles are simple enough. And I think that anyone who tries to tell you that it's too complicated to have meaningful community participation in discussions around how AI is going to shape who wins, who loses, who benefits, who doesn't. So in Kenya, the government of Kenya is trying to work out how AI distributes public services, which is sort of parallels to humanitarian. You know, you can talk to loads of Kenyans who are not very digitally literate, but will understand what that means as long as you communicate that in the appropriate way. And anyone who says otherwise is being lazy or otherwise, or ... So I think that is absolutely right, Heather, who made that point earlier, 100%. I mean, there is nothing stopping us from doing that. This is not the purview of just computer scientists. These are multi-domain, multi-industry, sort of multi-expertise technologies that need all of us around the table to do that. And then the other thing I would say, it's the same thing I feel like I've been saying for decades, does that make me old? That we need to put our money where our mouth is, right? Instead of going to Google, Microsoft, and Palantir, look to firms in the global South. There are loads of firms in the global South, whether it's South Asia or Latin America or Africa, who are medium-sized enterprises who are building equally good capabilities that will be relevant for humanitarian agencies that don't, that's how we shift power rather than just sort of technological monopolies.
Nicola, how have you dealt with that question?
We have, and this is something we try to do. So we're in a specific place whereby the people that our beneficiaries are mostly healthcare institutions rather than patients. So we do not, let's say, screen ourselves. We partner with healthcare institutions in low to middle countries, and they will use either our training or technology to do screening. We found out very quickly that it goes nowhere if you do not have full engagement of your stakeholders on the ground in those communities. Because I think Google found out the hard way. They had that technology very similar to ours. They tried to deploy, I think, 2019. They spent, I think, $5 million or something like this to deploy it, but it failed miserably, and they had to stop using within a few days because they didn't take into account kind of local environments when it comes to screening and what you can expect in terms of image quality and so on for medical imaging. So we engage day to day with stakeholders on the ground. We try to have technical expertise from the global South and low to middle income countries. For example, many of our developers are from Zambia, from African countries, from India, and we definitely gain a lot from it. It's very surprising that there is a lot of this kind of a monolithic view of development, especially in software engineering, but now also in AI from the West, and kind of having people giving other point of view and approaches and bringing, especially when it comes to not pure technical stuff, but ethics and impact on people and risk management. It's invaluable to us to have kind of the diversity in the team, not only the team, but also in the stakeholders we engage day to day. As I said, I don't think we will go anywhere without that. So I think it's a mandatory step. We're lucky enough that we already had those networks in place before I joined, so I didn't have to do a lot of work to get there. But yeah, no, absolutely mandatory for the type of work we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Another topic I see popping up here in various questions is about data. So how do we make sure we have good data, the right data that doesn't lead to wrong output or wrong decisions by the AI? Natalia, I know that's something you're very experienced in because you come from the data side, right? So what's your view on that?
Yeah, I'm sure Nicola can also talk about it, but yeah, data is the basis. And I think I've seen so many cartoons now that people put in like a person going like 2 steps ahead, and then the data is the foundation. Then you have analytics, AI, and then generative AI. They just jump in, and you cannot jump in if you don't have the data for AI. Generative may be a bit different because it's foundational models that are pre-trained. But if you're talking about AI, you need good data, and data foundation is a key. So you have to start with the foundation. So there's no way around it.
Just to add to that, I would say we spend 95% of our time dealing with data, curating data, QAing data, and it's becoming increasingly difficult because data used to be free. I remember when I used to work for tech startup in, 10 years ago, you could go to a hospital and ask for data, especially for research projects, and you would just get it. Nowadays, data is such a expensive commodity that it's both very expensive, but also very easy to get really bad data or dangerous data. So for example, you have a lot of data brokers. Let's say one of the biggest one is from India. The problem is you're going to get data relatively cheaply, but the quality and the legality and ethical aspect of the data is very questionable. And I see many organizations getting data from those sources, but I think it's quite a big risk to take, especially if you're in a kind of regulated environment where you have to, demonstrate patient consent, for example, for the data you use. And we've been seeing that for decades with marketing data and what have you. And now we have patient data you can buy, you have all types of data, but I think it's a very dangerous thing to do. But at the same time, it's so difficult to get the data. As Sarah mentioned, if you are a startup in an African country, where do you get your data? You're not OpenAI, who can spend millions or billions to scrape all the internet's data. Especially in a medical field, it's impossible now. Data. I was quoted by a hospital the other day, it was $15 per image. And when you did millions of images to train a model, it's definitely out of reach from small organizations or startups or NGOs alike. So I think it highlights the importance of high quality open source data sets, but that comes with other, how do you do that for medical images in a way that complies with regulations and both medical and privacy and so on. It's very complicated, but we need those big open data sets, both to evaluate solutions or products on the same unique data sets. You can actually tell whether products actually work, because I would never trust a manufacturer's data on that. But also to give the opportunity of smaller organizations or less funded organization to have a chance in creating new tools and a new product. Very quick on this, there was this moment in ophthalmology and eye care where a big data set was released. I think it was 2017, was a Kaggle competition. And that one data set spurred, I would say, hundreds of startups, because finally you had one data set that people could use to build really solid models that was competing with Google and other big organizations. Unfortunately, this was, early days, so 10 to 100,000 images was sufficient. Nowadays, you need way more than this to be competitive, and it's a really big problem to solve, I think.
Absolutely.
Can I, Danielle, jump in
yes,
quickly?
sorry, Sarah. Yes, I can.
A couple of very like vignettes from Nairobi is that, just to back up Nicola's point, is that some of the Kenyan startups here have really struggled to try and acquire some data from Google for medical imaging processes, because they're black and brown skin. So therefore, Google's been prevented from releasing that outside the United States. And the Kenyans are like, man, we could use that data, please, because the market is not filled with that data. But this is where sort of like the ethical limits of big tech and where they place those ethics, which is where someone asked, Alberto asked, where does ethics happen? I mean, it really ultimately happens in corporate and legal compliance, right? And so they placed measures within Google or Alphabet to not release that data. The other thing about sort of the human behind the data that you mentioned, Nicola, where you're like, we're curating, we're labeling, we're doing these things, it's human beings doing that, right? Like, let's not pretend that data is apolitical. The people who are labeling and curating and manipulating and managing and building that data set have their own personal beliefs and biases. So again, to Alberto's question, like, that's also where ethics happen. And there's a real live issue in Kenya right now, for those of you who are following it, about Kenyans who are training ChatGPT and GPT-4 and others to try and, there are human beings behind there trying to say, this is what, this is the data you should be looking at as a model, and this is the data you shouldn't be looking at. And the last point about data being expensive, and sort of not to burst another bubble of big tech, but Again, there's a multinational tech firm who's based in Nairobi or has a headquarters in Nairobi who is all about, sort of climate change. And there was a meeting that we had with an NGO who's really excited about anticipatory action, predictive analytics. Everyone got in the room to talk about what that would look like. How does this big tech organization and this NGO who's got a huge footprint try and bring this together to really do rapid response in less than 12 hours. And the ultimate question was, how much are you going to pay us, the big tech firm, as part of the grant from the donor? And we were talking like $50,000, $100,000 from a grant for a firm that has a market capitalization of like several billion or several trillion. So there is a darker side of some of this stuff that isn't being surfaced enough that should be.
Thank you, Sarah. And building on another aspect of data, I see the points that Mass and Liz are making here around if you want training data, for example, to look at your own internal processes for predictive analytics, maybe for automation. How can you go about it? How much data do you need to get something sensible out of your model? Natalia, what have you seen there? What would you say to that question?
I think that we've been using not enough data as an excuse often in AI for predictive models generally. And of course, there's some differences between very high risk models like medical prediction and medical recommendations is of course different. But if we're talking about predicting in HR, if person is going to leave or if they're happy, satisfied, or those kind of predictions that are not so risky, then typically the data that is available in an organization is enough to train a model. So that's one sentence really I've also been saying for a while. This really it should not be an excuse. Also the quality, it does take, like Nicola said, 90% of the time to clean and process the data. It does take so long, but you can do that. You can clean and process the data, and you can have those predictive models in your organization. And one idea is a bit crazy idea that is out there right now, and in the sense of large amounts of data, having these large amounts of data, for example, in images, not medical. I would stay again away from the very highly regulated medical space. But if we're talking about predicting something like images and of satellite images of something, you can generate synthetic data using AI. So it's like AI generating itself some data. So there are options to deal with data, how much data you create in your organization, how much you can use it. Of course, you have to start collecting it, right? I've been to companies, I've been on projects where we came in and we want a prediction and they had no history, zero. So I said, okay, let's see you in 2 years, right? So you have to start collecting data, but I think we're past that point. Most organizations have a data storage, they start collecting data, they have a lot of data, and 1-2 years of data is enough to start building a model, and it of course learns with time, right? So we could keep the model keeps learning. When you progress, people change their behavior, so we have to retrain the models, and this is what is a normal standard process. And I see Nicholas nodding, so I'm sure you would agree.
Just on that, I totally agree. And I think the view of we need millions of entries or 10 of millions is quite an early machine learning view. And nowadays, when you have foundational models or pre-trained models, and you do fine tuning, for example, you don't need nearly as much. We see that in the computer vision field where I work, where we needed at least 100,000 examples to make anything usable. Nowadays, if you have a very niche thing you want to be able to do, you can get away with 1,000 or 2,000 images if you have really high quality data sets and the matching kind of validation sets you want. So I think technologically and the kind of tool sets to get models trained change quite a bit to facilitate using smaller data set as well. But I also encourage that the first step is always the data that was mentioned. So at Orbis, I know there's been a lot of efforts we're wasting a lot of data. Like every organization wastes a lot of data. So you have data in silos or data that is used for, let's say, a program, and then is kind of left on a hard drive somewhere. And I think it takes a lot of effort to make sure that the data that you need now, or the data you think you might need in the medium term, is properly kind of stored and documented, and not necessarily in the final format, but at least it's there if you need it at some point. It's not always possible due to various regulatory constraints, but where possible, I will encourage that the first step towards building models is putting process into place to have some type of data governance and data storage going on.
And just to close maybe on the question of data, but first step is data, but I have to remind you what Sarah said first. The other first step is the right question. So what is it that you want it for? Because again, the data you need is going to be different than if you're doing a prediction of a sickness of or something, or if you're doing a prediction in a different context. So the data is not always data. So first, you need to ask the right question. You need to know why are you doing this? Why are you doing AI? What do you need it for? Then go look for the right data, and I'm sure it's there. There is some way to get the data, or it's there, or produce it, or clean it. So that's the first steps.
Thank you, Natalia. Sarah.
I was just going to say one quick thing about that, because there is a sort of wider risk that I see around in like sort of 2019, no one cared about AI, at least in the humanitarian world. People were like, what does that mean? Ad interim? Like, what's AI? What are you talking about? And then now there's a big scramble for everyone to clean data. And most of us on the line will remember the days, or at least I do, because I'm old, remember where you had paper forms for, you know, doing refugee status determination or intake and assessment forms or anything else. And there is loads of data out there that's all analog, not digitized. Some of it is digitized in like horrible Excel sort of formats. But what I see in the last year is a move to try and clean and maintain and like manage and scrub all the data that we do have, to order it in a way that would be more profitable, or more efficient for agencies. At the same time, I'm seeing an increase in uses of AI and other tools to basically remove any barriers for cybersecurity. And that makes me worried, right? So if you're a humanitarian agency, big or small, you're trying to figure out how to monetize, not in a financial way, but in a sort of impact way, the data that you have, without also doing a good calculation about what that means for your risk profile in a cybersecurity sense. And I want to highlight the ICRC hack that they made public last year, and 500,000 individuals had their data compromised, and the data custody chain is a real thing. UNHCR, I think, has data on 37 million people. If someone from HCR is on the line, they can correct, but they've got PII on 37 million people. We just have to be very careful about weighing those costs and benefits, cleaning and managing that data to deliver us efficiencies through AI and machine learning, versus really making it very easy to expose and also hack into some of the most vulnerable communities that we serve.
Absolutely. So we're almost getting to the end of our session, and now we've spoken a lot about the issues, the risks of AI. I want to try and end us on a little bit of a positive note and say, okay, so AI can obviously, we're in a time of multi-crisis, and obviously, yes, AI has the chance of making things worse, but there's also a chance of it making things better and address some of the underlying reasons for the crisis, whether it's climate change, whether it's hunger, you name it. What are those killer examples of AI application in your point of view that would really make a difference? Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah, don't buy it from big tech, buy it from local, buy it from the global south, buy it from small and medium-sized enterprises, and start with the problem first, right? Do localized, not monopolistic, you know, work out a way to use data to drive better action. The caveat to that, not to make it sound like a negative conclusion, but the caveat to that is that I do question whether better insight leads to better action. I mean, there's a whole level of like sort of emotion and politics layered on top of that we need to constantly keep in mind, that just because we've got better insights doesn't mean that we'll have better actions. But sure, I think in this case, smaller is better, right? We're not looking to like launch AI into climate change. It's like, where are the small wins?
And I would agree with that. And also with the, let's understand what problem we are trying to solve, because sometimes we just don't. Natalia.
I really think it's going to be the sum of the small wins. I don't know. Maybe I'm not visionary enough. I believe there is maybe someone who has a vision of this one big AI solving world hunger. I don't think this is it. I think this is the sum of the small pieces. I think it's really using it in the right places, in agriculture, in small organizations, in everywhere in our daily life, for the right decisions, for the right purposes, to have more efficient work in every work that non-profits are doing, right? They make this work more efficient, so you have more time to help people, so you have more time, and it's going to be this human-machine interaction that will make really our lives better. So I do believe in that. I believe AI is necessary. We should keep forcing it somehow, despite the risks, because we can handle. I hope we can handle the risk. We can manage the risks. If we manage the risk, if we do it in a safe way, if we add up all those positive impacts, it's going to make a huge impact in the end on our society and on our lives.
Thank you, Natalia. And Nicola?
I would echo the small wins. I'm always wary when I see kind of organization or startups, they're always solving climate change with AI. But okay. But the one big area where I think is already making, I think it's the only area where I would say AI had a really positive impact is, I think it was mentioned before, is drug discovery, where I think this is one area where we already see the fruit of using AI and coming up with new chemicals. And I have a background in biochemical engineering, so I find this very exciting. But I think this is a one kind of potentially, world-changing use of the technology, because you're coming up with better vaccine and what have you. The small wins are where it's at right now. I think for example, I use a generative AI model to help me code every day, and this is time I can then use to manage people, talk to my team, and brainstorm the next step instead of spending most of my time coding. And the same tools allow people, not necessarily from a technical background, to build applications and to innovate without having to spend years learning about programming language. And so I think it's kind of use of AI, as it was mentioned, that will make, when taken all together, will make a huge difference. But I'm not sure we're going to see, as I was mentioned, like this one big model solving societal issues right now in the near future.
And I would say I hope so, because that's a rather scary thought as well, isn't it? To have this one big, wonderful AI that will solve all our problems. Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, audience, for all your thoughts and questions. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I hope we covered kind of the key topics of discussion. And clearly there is a lot of discussion, and it's very clear we don't have all the answers today. But this is where we can continue to collaborate, and as NetHope, we will continue to try and convene all the actors in the space to have those conversations, and also to find those use cases, those small, manageable but effective use cases that will bring the sector and those we aim to help forward. There were a few people that shared resources. If it's okay, we will send those out with the summary of the webinar and the recording, so everyone can have a look at those. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sure we will see each other soon in another AI conversation. Seth, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniela. And many thanks to our excellent and engaged audience. Thank you for all your comments and questions today. Thank you again to our speakers for joining us. And remember, everyone, this webinar series needs your voice. You can help us to improve this vital resource for the NetHope community by filling out our satisfaction survey. Links are in the chat, and they will also be in our follow-up email and on the webinar landing page at nethope.org. And that follow-up email will be coming your way in the next few hours with links to the webinar recording, the slides, and other resources shared during today's presentation and discussion. So on behalf of our presenters and NetHope, we wish you a great rest of your day wherever you are in our wide world. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.